So I really always loved science. And as a kid too, just I wanted to learn about how everything works. But I wasn't sure if college or the academy was really for me. For personal reasons, I ended up like dropping out of high school and not finishing that. And so I didn't necessarily think that I was going to go the academic route. But I did end up going to undergrad, and in my second year, I took an undergraduate course in neuroscience. And I had a really wonderful professor who arranged to take students to the Society for Neuroscience meeting. So this really big, like 40,000 plus neuroscience meeting. And it was in Chicago that year. And I remember walking in and just feeling so overwhelmed by how large it was and what a big community. But it was really inspiring because there were researchers from literally all over the world. And they were conducting work in humans, in whales, in rats, in dogs, studying the brain, like all sorts of different levels. And that was really from like the population of neurons to kind of population levels of patterns of disease. And so that definitely sparked my interest. It actually started with behavioral neuroscience, and I did work in earthworms. So we did an experiment to see if caffeine affected earthworm locomotion. And then from there, it kind of took off. I've now worked with humans and rats, even giant pouched rats in Tanzania, and have stayed in it ever since that first Society for Neuroscience meeting. The work, though, I do kind of basic and translational neuroscience research. The basic research looks a lot at like questions related to fundamental biological processes happening in the brain. And then the translational research is a little bit more about like taking our knowledge from basic research and applying it into more clinical applications. So like the development of new therapies or new interventions. But I use neuroimaging tools, primarily functional magnetic resonance imaging, to understand neurobiology of post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm really interested in identifying potential neural biomarkers, which are essentially markers in the brain that are associated with risk of developing PTSD or resilience after someone experiences an acute trauma. So I love what I do, actually. I really love it. I think my favorite part of the job, and particularly in postdoc where you have like a little bit more freedom, is coming up with new research questions. I also really like writing. I think that's kind of underestimated of how much time neuroscientists spend writing, whether it be grants or papers. Because neuroscience is a relatively new field, particularly neuroimaging, the tools and the approaches change a lot. Even from when I first started my PhD, which was not that long ago, I think like being a neuroscientist means learning kind of constantly, learning new things every couple of months, staying on top of new findings, continuing to like learn about software developments and attending workshops on how to use certain tools. And it's just in general, like being very open to change. Yeah. Yeah, so my path has been slightly unusual. So in undergrad, I studied neuroscience, so I majored in neuroscience. And then after undergrad, I really wanted a job that had kind of this immediate impact on people's lives, but still, like I was doing behavioral research in undergrad, so wanted to continue that. So I ended up going to Tanzania to work with an organization called Apopo. And the head of research there went to my undergrad institute, so there were some connections, which I'll touch on probably a little bit of the importance of networking, right? But Apopo trains giant African pouched rats, they're about the size of a small cat, for scent detection, humanitarian scent detection applications, essentially everything that a task that a dog can do, a rat can do. That position didn't have any neuroscience techniques. It was behavioral research, but it focused a lot on like core processes of learning and memory, which we know in PTSD is quite relevant. And then when it was kind of time to go to graduate school, I started my graduate training in another lab. It wasn't a great fit, so I transitioned to work with another mentor. And this is the part that's like not very unusual. and I think is helpful for trainees to remember, is that at any stage of training, it's so important to find a good mentor. And that really means finding someone who's supportive, kind, and respectful. And that a lot of people transition between mentors. And I think that I also stay partly to advocate for people who historically are like unlikely to be encouraged or to either stay in or to pursue science in the first place. And I know that I had my own experiences like that that made me consider not applying to school, undergrad or grad, and also leaving academia. So I think that's part of it as well. So I thought about this one as well. I think that my advice is threefold. So one would be to pursue your interests. I think on my paper, and even when I meet with trainees, sometimes they feel like their CV doesn't tell a story, that their experiences look unfocused. But I think that actually everyone has a story that does make sense in the context of that individual's or that trainee's interests and the opportunities that they were provided. And neuroscience is definitely like more interdisciplinary, more collaborative than it was 20 years ago, for sure. And I think that more often than not, having a student that maybe, has multiple interests or has different experiences, even ones that are vastly different than like a core research experience, wind up creating really interesting research questions. And then two, and I wish that I'd been told this actually when I was starting out, was that like your perspective and your experience, even if they're not traditional, they deserve to be heard. And I hope that particularly students from minoritized groups really take this one to heart, that like you deserve to be here, your ideas are valuable and important, and it's going to ultimately make better science. And then three, and I've talked about this a little bit throughout, but the networking. So really like find your people and connect with them. Community is like so important. And that kind of hits you when you walk into one of the big conferences in the beginning, and there's these little groups, the pockets of people talking to each other. And that didn't happen accidentally. That happened through kind of this community building